And joining us now, former CIA Director John Brennan. It's good to see you, Director Brennan. Let's talk about what's happening right now in the region. With the U.S. strikes against these Iranian-backed proxies in Iraq and Syria, do you think this is going to be a deterrent to Tehran, which is clearly behind this?
Well, I think it's going to have an impact in terms of degrading the capabilities of some of these militias that have been carrying out these attacks. It's clear the Biden administration now has directed U.S. military forces in the region to shift from a defensive posture to a preventive and preemptive one. In the past, the U.S. forces would wait for a missile or a rocket or a drone to be launched before they would destroy it. But what we have seen over the past several days is now the U.S. is going after those capabilities on the ground, the launchers, the weapon depots, other types of things, that to degrade the capability and take away the ability of these groups to carry out these attacks. So I do think we're going to see more strikes against these areas. But as was shown just by this attack that killed some of the Syrian Kurdish forces, these militia extremist groups supported by Iran have a mobile capability, mobile launchers, other types of things. So they're going to move about. So I think the U.S. military is going to have to continue to focus on trying to find them, degrade them, carry out strikes, be able to take away the capability to strike U.S. forces.
You know, there are two missions really in the region right now. And then there's the overall issue of Iran and whether or not they should go directly to Iran territorially. They're going to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, as you know, to the regime's military wing. But they are not listening to Senate critics who say you should be bombing Iran. Let me play a little bit of Senator Lindsey Graham from Fox.
If the goal is to deter Iran, you're failing miserably. If the goal is to protect American troops, you're not achieving your goal. If you've convinced Iran we don't want a wider war, they believe you. Oh, I don't want a war with you. They got the message. What they're not afraid of us. They were afraid of Trump. They're not afraid of us.
So we should emphasize Donald Trump didn't bomb Iran. He went after the Iranian Quds Force leader Soleimani on Iraqi soil, much to the distress of our allies who were not warned about it, our NATO allies. But in any case, what is your reaction to all of this? And the separate mission that I should mention is against the Houthis to deter them from the international shipping, and that is separately a defensive posture from this aggressive reaction that started Friday night against the Iranian interests in Iraq and Syria.
Well, what Senator Graham is calling for is a major escalation and basically war with Iran. If we were to strike the sovereign state of Iran, it's, to me, very clear that Iran would respond with strikes against various positions along the Gulf Coast in terms of the Gulf Arab states and others. Iran has a formidable military. It's a country of 90 million people. And striking against Iranian commandos that are working with these groups inside of Iraq or Syria, even inside of Yemen, is one thing. But going after the sovereign state of Iran, also, there are a lot of folks in Congress that would very much object to the Biden administration authorizing strikes inside of Iran. They would want to have congressional authorization for that, just the way there was congressional authorization for the use of military force in Afghanistan and then also in Iraq. But for the Biden administration to just unilaterally do this in response to those attacks that have been taking place against U.S. forces, again, I think it would be a major, major escalation and something that would ensure a broadening and a widening of the conflict in the Middle East.
And I want to ask you about this hostage deal, the framework that was agreed to in Paris the Sunday before yesterday, so a week and a day ago, and that this was negotiated by one of your successors, Bill Burns, on behalf of the U.S., by 3 top intelligence officials on behalf of Israel. Everyone signed the text, according to all of my reporting. So it was the head of Mossad, Shin Bet, and IDF intelligence, all there at the table, as well as Qatar and Egypt on behalf of different factions of Hamas. Hamas has not signed on to it. Netanyahu has said very critical things about it, but Israel did agree to it through their representatives. So clearly, Netanyahu is taking care of his immediate political problem, if you will, his right-wing ministers, so that his government doesn't fall. But they're all in on not the details. The details are tough. The number of Palestinian prisoners and who they would be in exchange for for the hostages, the duration of the ceasefire, the pauses. So all of that is very tough to do. But the framework is accepted by everybody but Hamas right now.
Yes, and I think it's appropriate that it's being negotiated in intelligence channels and among these players. But clearly, Hamas is the last holdout. And it's probably, as you point out, the details involved here. I do think that Israel is keenly interested in getting as many, if not all, of its hostages back as soon as possible, and is willing to have an extended pause in the fighting. I think Hamas is trying to determine exactly how the cadence of this release is going to take place, what are going to be some of the arrangements and conditions related to it. But Hamas is the one that ultimately is going to have to decide, even if all these other parties agree to it, unless Hamas agrees to move forward, I think we're going to continue to see some delays here. But I think this is why Secretary Blinken is going out to the region, again, trying to stimulate and make sure that those who have bought onto this, namely all the Israeli intelligence and military forces, and Netanyahu's, I think, blessing of it, will be still in existence when Hamas ultimately, I hope, agrees to sign on to this deal.
And we just showed you a picture. It's an official photo from a White House, rather State Department photographer, I believe. It may be a pool photo as well, but the video was not permitted, with the Saudi leader and Blinken. Just a quick question. Explain to our viewers how complicated getting Hamas to sign on is. That there are factions to Hamas. They're all radical. They're all, terrorists, but there's the political wing outside of Gaza, and then there are at least two leaders inside Gaza. To get all of that coordinated is very, very challenging, correct?
Yes, there's just so many players and actors involved here. And I think one of the holdouts, quite frankly, is inside of Gaza, because you have Hamas, you have the Palestine Islamic Jihad, and then I think you have Palestinian gangs who also are holding some of these hostages. So they all have to agree to this. Now, I'm sure that there's outside, pressure coming from various parties on Hamas to agree to this. And the Saudis, I think, can play an important role. But ultimately, it's going to come down to whether or not Hamas leadership is able to deliver in terms of the arrangements that will allow the ceasefire to be initiated and to be able to be maintained, but also then to be able to deliver those hostages wherever they may be in hiding inside of Gaza.